morning, everybody. Many thanks to Professor Ball for the invitation to come and share this event with you. I hope I can follow the first speaker. I'm afraid that I'm speaking to you in English. If I spoke in German, it would be embarrassing for us all, and we'd probably be here until late tonight. But I must admit that Google Translate is very, very good when you're sitting in the audience listening to a language where you're not totally fluent in. So I'd like to spend some time talking about HR's role in building high performance in the future workplace. And you may wonder why the first screen here is a photograph I took of a structure that's 5,000 years old. This is Stonehenge, which is a Bronze Age structure built not very far from where I live in England. And the reason I've put that there is that I want to talk first of all about change, because I think that change is thank you very much. Perfect, thank you. Change is the underlying driver that all of us face all of the time. And even when we think we're working in organizations or we're doing things which have great consistency, underlying it is a great change. And I think one of the challenges, certainly that I've faced for the last 40 years of my professional life, is how we help people adapt to change. And I had a photograph of Stonehenge. This is a photograph I took of the cathedral. I live in the city of Winchester in England. I was actually born and brought up in Australia, so it's really exciting for me to live and to look out on a building that's about as old as Leipzig. They started to build this building in 1067, so it's coming up for its 1,000 years. And this is the attempt that the English do to replicate a German Christmas market, with not as effective as the Berlin or the other Christmas markets I've been to. So really I want to talk about, as I said, just talk a little bit about change, because for me, the key components, the key elements of driving sustainable change are, first of all, mindset, helping people change the way they think, and that drives the way they behave, and also culture. Because culture, whether it's in an organization, in a nation, or whatever it is, they're the key factors that underpin sustainable change. And in my experience, getting that mindset change is often really difficult. Change is a real challenge, and change doesn't often happen overnight. And I often go back to this man who I have very few sort of heroes I would put up as my great heroes, and this man's one of them, George Bernard Shaw, the great Irish playwright. Well, he was a polymath. He was, until 2016, the only person to be awarded both an Oscar and a Nobel Prize. And in 2016, another polymath, Bob Dylan, was also awarded a Nobel Prize. So both of them have Oscars and Nobel Prize. But George Bernard Shaw said this: progress is impossible without change, and those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. So I think that when we think about how we're helping our organizations to change and adapt, we have to think about how we get those mindsets changed and change the culture. But underneath that, there's a lot of very practical things we need to do. So I'm going to spend the time talking about high-performing organizations and the role that human resources, HR professionals can play in high-performing organizations. And I've thought I'd start by talking a little bit about Germany's most famous export to the UK. You know, you may think that it was Audi or Mercedes-Benz, but Jürgen Klopp is, without a doubt, the most important, I think, or the most famous export. And I have two sons and a daughter, and all of them are very passionate football followers, and all of them are very passionate about Liverpool. And I've spent a bit of time looking at what it is that Klopp does that really has created change within a very short time, in this case, a few years, really does that. And Klopp does a number of things. he first of all gives people the freedom to do what they want to do. And I love this quote from Takamine Minamano, who's, when he came to join Liverpool, he said this shortly after joining. I cannot forget his words. 2 or 3 days after joining the club, he said, I could play in any way I wanted to play, just enjoy playing. And I think that's really indicative of what's been talked about before in terms of giving people the freedom to do what they want to do and not trying to control exactly everything people do. And Klopp's leadership style could be defined in these ways. First of all, create a very clear vision and identity. Then represent that identity in core values. In other words, live it, do it, present it. Reinforce belief and create trust. Build strong connections with players, and then promise and over-deliver. Now, I think any of us could look at this, and this could be any organization in the world, their aspirations. So, you could take this not from a football club, but you could take it from any large or small organization in the world and say, what do we aspire to do? We aspire our leadership to do this. Unfortunately, not very many actually manage it, but that's important. But underpinning all of this, in Klopp's approach, is building a culture of continuous learning and improvement. And that's what I want to spend my time talking about today. And in fact, I don't like the term learning culture very much, because I was saying last night, I was talking over a drink and was saying that I think when we talk about learning culture, often there's a missing word there. We think about formal learning culture. So in organizations, they think about how can we create a learning culture? Well, we need to make sure that we provide wonderful learning pathways, and we need to do all the formal things, which are really important. But actually, that's not creating a learning culture. That's creating a formal learning culture. That's why I like the concept and the term creating a culture of continuous improvement, because we're not looking just at the individuals. We're not just looking at people working in organizations, but we're thinking about continuous improvement for teams and for the organization as a whole. And one of the challenges I see that HR professionals have is to step up from thinking about individuals to thinking about how we help the organization create value. And I know I'm old enough to, in English, HR used to be called personnel. It was around how do we make sure that we recruit the right people, we onboard them, we help them develop, we see them through their time in the organization, and then we help them leave. But actually, HR has other jobs as well, which is around how do we help the organization change and develop and improve as we go on. So I want to get you involved in a little bit. We're going to ask you a couple of questions. I'm going to ask you one now and one later on. And if you've got a phone, a device, a phone, a pad or whatever, I'd like to ask you a question about how you think learning really happens. So if you just go to, I don't know whether any of you have used Menti before, if you just go to, if you can click on the QR code or just go to menti.com and enter that code. Okay? What do you see? You see the screen? Great, okay, as long as you see the screen. All right, everyone have it? Good, okay. So, the question I'd like to ask you is this. The first question is, if you think back to one great learning experience that you've had in your life. Now, it could be that actually improved your own performance, your personal performance. Now, it could have been when you were a child. Maybe one of your parents taught you to ride a bicycle, or to swim, or to throw a ball. Or it could have been when you were at school and you learned something like some mathematical problem, you suddenly understood things. Or it may have been when you were working on a project with a team of people. Or it may have been yesterday when you were having maybe a meeting or a conversation with people. So the question I want to ask you is not what that experience was, but I want to ask you, where did that experience occur? Did it occur in a classroom or some structured learning environment? Or did it occur whilst you were trying to complete a task or achieve a specific outcome? So what you should be able to see, you may have to refresh your screen, but you should be able to see this question here. And I'd like you to answer it, please. So where did this great learning experience occur? So I can see I'm getting some input here, 37, 38. Now this rather surprises me, because here we are in an educational establishment. Here I am standing like a professor in front of a class, okay, and most of you are telling me this. To be honest, I've asked this question over the last 10 years of at least 100,000 people. And the response I've had is very consistent. In fact, it's so consistent, I don't know what you'd look at there. We've got 51 to 5. Okay, that's about a ratio of 10 to 1. That surprises me. I would have thought, we're in a formal learning environment. We've all had great professors. We've all had great teachers. But I was so confident, or I am so confident, that I put this figure up afterwards. Because in my experience, when asked that question, around about 80% of us say it was when I was doing something, when I was trying to achieve something and I finally managed to do it, and that was a great learning experience. And the challenge we have is that many of us still think about learning as being associated with formal, structured, away from work activities. Even though we know deep in our hearts, we know that, of course, those formal structured learning activities are really important, but we also learn, most of the learning happens when we're actually trying to achieve things. And in fact, I worked with a man called Jay Cross for a number of years. He died in 2016. Now, Jay was a Californian. Well, he wasn't a Californian. He was actually born in the same bed that Bill Clinton was born in Arkansas. But he lived in California, and he was a very typical Californian, Jay. And he wrote a number of books around the power of informal learning. And Jay often used to say to me, he said, Charles, the problem is that many people find it difficult to differentiate schooling from learning. We come through school, we come through university, we're structured into thinking about learning as being structured, and that's only part of it, because a lot of it happens outside of learning. So when we think about how adults really learn in practice, I think there are 4 key ways in which people learn and in which we, as HR and learning professionals, can support them. And this little infogram was done by a chap called Tanmay Vora. And he took a number of things. He listened to a number of talks I'd given and read a lot of things that I'd written, and he pulled out, and I think he did it really well, pulled out some key elements of things that I've been saying for at least the last decade or more about how we learn. We learn through, first of all, through experiences, through rich and challenging experiences. And I should say this, all the little bits around this are don't come from me. Some of them come from a man called Charles Handy, who some of you may know, who is a wonderful Irish management guru, and he and I had conversations around the 70-20-10 model, which is focused around the fact that when we look at high performers, or when we look at anyone, about 90%, about 70 plus 20 of our learning comes from other people and from learning at work, and probably about 10% from formal learning. And so Charles and I had some discussions around this, and he said, when we got to reflection, he said, of course, experiences plus reflection is really the learning that lasts. So we learn from rich and challenging experiences. We learn from the opportunity to practice. And many of us working in knowledge industries, or where we earn our living and work with our heads rather than our hands, tend to forget that. If we go back to the football analogy, to Jürgen Klopp and his team, sports people absolutely understand the importance of practice. It would be crazy to think that top sports people don't perform and then go away and perform again. They go away and practice a lot and come back. And so they're continually in a cycle of continuous improvement. And I could, if I had time, I don't have time today, tell you some interesting stories about Rafa Nadal, because I've worked with a man called Santiago Alvarez de Mon, who's a professor at the AEC Business School in Barcelona, and he's worked with Nadal from when Nadal was a boy, or he's studied Nadal, and Nadal is what they call an obsessive reflector. So Nadal really focuses in on, if I can, this one here, time for reflection. And often people say to me, we don't have time to reflect. Well, the answer is, if someone like Nadal, who works in far more challenging environment than any of us would ever work in. I mean, I don't know whether any of you saw him play in the French Open at Roland Garros just last week. I mean, this man is unbelievable. He outperforms his talent. And in fact, Santiago Alvarez de Mon once said to a group of people when I was there, he said, Nadal has never been the best in the top 5 in terms of talent in the world, but of course he's one of the best tennis players because he is an obsessive reflector. He hardly ever makes the same mistake twice. So we learn through challenging experiences, we learn through the opportunity to practice, we learn through creative conversations and networks, and there's a lot of research that shows that those people who have more rich and diverse networks are better performers. There's another Cross, actually, Rob Cross, who's a professor in the US, who's studied social network analysis for many years and demonstrated that people who have better networks are better performers. But also reflection, which is really, really critical. So that's how adults in work really learn. So that raises the question for me, why focus on performance? Why is performance the thing that we should focus on? Why shouldn't we focus on learning or behavior or engagement or other things like that? And I want to give you some examples of, well, dispel a few myths around what drives high performance. Because particularly in HR, to be honest, there are some myths about high performance. What is it that creates a high-performing organization? What is it that creates helps people become high performers? And I'd just like to dispel a couple. I'm going to take the first one. There's, I think, a lot of effort put in to increase employee engagement. In fact, there's a whole industry being created for organizations around helping build employee engagement. Employee engagement is really important. Employee engagement, job satisfaction, and organizational commitment, in other words, engagement, actually it lowers turnover and it increases employee health. But the relationship between high performance and engagement is actually the other way around. Employees who are more engaged are not necessarily higher performers, but higher performers are more engaged. So the research tells us, and actually Michael Ricketta, a German researcher who's worked also in the UK, has did a meta-study a number of years ago that demonstrated this. So we should be focusing on creating a high-performing workforce rather than a highly engaged workforce, because if you do the high performance, you will find greater engagement. If you focus on engagement, you won't necessarily find or deliver high performance. So it's the other way around. This Science at Work did this graphic on the left here. So the other myth really is that learning actually provides the opportunity to work better. Now that is the case, but actually a stronger relationship is that opportunities to do challenging work drives more learning. So this man who we've done some work with at the 70-20-10 Institute, Professor Andreas de Grip, heads up the European Research Centre for Education and the Labour Market. And de Grip and his colleagues are not HR people, they're not learning people, they're all economists. And economists have understood this for many years, that if you want to build capability, you look at the workplace, and you can see, I've just put some quotes here from de Grip. De Grip said, informal learning is far more important for workers' human capital development than formal training courses. they found that even when people join organizations, if we can create the environment where they can start to learn informally as part of work, that's more effective. And you can see at the bottom there, recent studies found that much of the performance of newly hired workers is driven by learning from doing and learning from their peers, other people, and their supervisors. So we know this as well. There's also a misconception, what I call a fiction, which I call the knowledge and skills fiction. And that is that if we build knowledge and skills, we will deliver high performance. And in fact, high performance is far more than that. I've just published a paper with a colleague in Australia, actually, called Performance Beyond the Skills Obsession. And you're very welcome I can provide a copy for you. You can download a copy of it. But we look at this factor that skills and knowledge are important, but if you focus on skills and knowledge alone, you won't deliver high performance. Because high performance is the sum of a number of things. 3 key things. High performance is the working environment. We have to create a working environment that encourages, and you were speaking about psychological safety, trust. It's about freedom to challenge without feeling that there's going to be consequences for that. It's around all of those sorts of things that Professor Amy Edmondson talks about very, very well around psychological safety. So the working environment from that point of view, the working environment also in the fact that we have clear objectives and clear processes, and we have the right tools to do our jobs. All of those things are really important. We can have all the knowledge and skills that we need, but unless we have the right working environment, we won't be able to deliver high performance. It's also about behaviors, obviously. It's about creating those right behaviors. It's like Klopp creating an environment and developing behaviors that people can be free, be autonomous. Again, you talked about the ability the requirement to be able to do that. And Daniel Pink, in his book Drive, talked about 3 key factors that drive engagement and performance: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So that we want to have autonomy, we want to have some freedom to make decisions, we want to get better at what we do. It's a core human factor. We all want to get better at what we do. Why otherwise, as Pink suggests, why do people learn to play musical instruments or do things that has no other value except from the enjoyment of getting better? And the purpose piece, which is where we need to make sure that our individual purpose is aligned with the organizational purpose. But lastly, and I think this gets forgotten about, is around taskability. So we need to make sure that we focus on how to help people complete tasks. And I think from the 70-20-10 approach and the methodology that I've worked on with some Dutch colleagues, that taskability is really important. And there's a bit of a tension between the idea of competencies, which are general sort of capabilities, I guess, and critical tasks, because competencies tend to be very general and tasks are very specific. And I'll come back and talk a little bit about those as well. But also underpinning all of this is good leadership. Because if we don't have clear leadership, if we don't have leaders and managers who set direction, encourage continuous improvement, continuous learning, we're really not going to achieve what we need to achieve. And this man, W. Edwards Deming, is, I think, well known. Some of you may have heard of him. Deming is held up as being responsible for the Japanese recovery after World War II, the Japanese incredible recovery in industry. And he was the founder of the total quality movement, total quality management, and all those sorts of things. And at various stages of his career, Deming stepped back and reflected on what it was, as he said here, what it was that drove organizational performance and taking opportunities for improvement and solving problems. And at the end of his career, he estimated that 94% of what drove performance was what he called the system. That was having the right environment, having the right tools, and having the right management. And 6% was what he called special, the performer. So from Deming's experience, when we're looking at high performance, it's not just about the individuals. It's about a lot of other layers above that. And I think that's really important from an HR professional point of view. Of course, we focus on individuals, but we need to focus on more than individuals. So how can HR make a real impact on performance? And I've identified 3 principles that I think are important on which you can act. And the first one is look beyond individual skills and competencies. The second one is focus your efforts where the best learning occurs. And the third one is work with managers and leaders who integrate learning into working. Now, it may sound simple. It's often not. So I want to just look at those principles. So looking beyond individual skills and competencies. This is the traditional model, I would suggest, that most organizations work when they build and support learning within the organization. They have a competency development framework, and maybe a skills framework with that. There's probably a management competencies as well. And from that, we develop a set of learning interventions, maybe some learning pathways, some formal learning structures. We might add some social learning into that. We may include some workplace learning into that. People ask me to come and look and review programs they have, and they say, Charles, we've developed this wonderful 70-20-10 approach. And I look at it and I say, it's a wonderful approach, but it's a formal learning approach. It's what I'd call 10 plus. It's great, but there's other things you can do as well. Then we maybe provide some learning support. But the point is, this approach keeps us in what I would call the learning zone. We're just maybe stepping into the performance zone because we're thinking as learning as being the output. We're not really focusing on performance. The other way to approach it, and the way that I've been working on for 7 or 8 years, in fact, my colleague Jos Ares, who's a Dutchman who's done a lot of work on this, just publishing a book on this, is we start at the other end. So if we're looking to build real capability, we start with looking at the organizational results. What is it that we want our organizations to do? How do we want our organizations to change? And then we also look at what are the critical tasks that need to be carried out in order to do that. So rather than thinking about competencies, we think about, okay, we need people to carry out these specific tasks. And then we also think about what are the influencing factors, what is in the environment which is going to help people execute those tasks. And then we can start building our solutions, our learning solutions from there. And what that leads to is building solutions which have greater impact and which almost always are embedded in the workplace as much as they are away from the workplace. So things such as how do we provide performance support? In fact, I was doing some work last year with a big company called Schlumberger in Houston, in Texas. And they'd come from the left-hand side. And we spent some time working with them. We ran a program for their L&D teams and their HR people, and they moved to rethinking the way they did things. So taking a performance-based approach will deliver greater performance at the organizational level, because you're starting to think about how do we link. The output isn't learning. Learning is a process. The output is performance. That's the key thing. And this methodology, don't worry about the complexity of this. This just comes from the book we wrote about it. But basically, what we defined was a number of roles that needed to be executed. And one of the key roles is this, what we call a performance detective, which an HR business partner, it's a role that either a learning professional or an HR business partner takes, which is really carrying out an effective performance analysis. Not a learning analysis, but a performance analysis. We identify what the organizational results are, what are the critical tasks, what are the environmental influences or factors involved. And so there's a performance detective, there's a performance architect. How do we design solutions to address those needs? Excuse me. And then there's a master builder who builds them, and so on and so forth. But the performance detective is a really critical role. And there is quite a lot of talk about the need for us to become more effective in carrying out performance analysis. And there's been a cry for this certainly for the last 30 years. But the performance analysis includes a business analysis, an influence analysis, and other things. And so it's about systematically evaluating the performance problems and identifying what needs to be done and what needs to be done first. Excuse me. Sorry. And I don't recommend buying this book. I'm serious. My two colleagues, Jos Arets and Vivian Hein, and I wrote this book. I'm afraid it's not in German. You can buy it in English or Dutch or in Korean, but it's a very technical 350-page book. In fact, the hardback weighs in at I think 1.8 kilograms. It's a coffee table thing, but that describes the approach, a performance-based approach. So thinking about performance rather than learning, and working from there. So the second principle is to focus your efforts where most performance occurs. And as I mentioned, most performance occurs in the workplace, and there's a lot of research which backs this up. So again, going back to the European Centre for Education and the Labour Market, these economists who spend their time studying the needs of labour at government level, basically, they've researched and found that when we look at time, about 96% of the time that we spend learning is actually partly is during the daily flow of work. About 4% is during formal learning. Now that's not surprising, because if you look at how most organizations structure their learning, this graph on the left here, this is every year the Association for Talent Development, American organization but global reach, the ATD publishes what they call their state of the industry. And the data that they gather from around the world includes the number of what they call learning hours per employee. As I say, there's a missing word in there. It's formal learning hours per employee. And the figures haven't changed very much. I've only got the figures here to 2017 for the top companies, but actually I've seen the figures for 2020 and they haven't changed much. So on average, organizations that are focused on supporting their employees provide about 50 hours per year of formal learning. All organizations that provide input into the ATD report provide about 35 hours. But when we look at the hours that we work, or the hours that people work, you can see where these figures of the 94 and 6% come from very quickly. Because if you look at the OECD data, now I pulled out the German data a couple of days ago. So the average annual hours worked by employees in 2020, in Germany it was 1,332 hours per year. The OECD average is a little higher than that. And you can see here, some countries are slightly lower, some countries like the US, where there's less holiday and longer hours, 1,767 hours, Koreans even higher. So if we think about 1,332 hours and then we can provide maybe 35 hours of formal learning, you can see where that figure of somewhere around about 2 to 4% of the opportunities for learning in terms of time comes from, in terms of formal learning. Yet as HR professionals, as learning professionals, we focus most of our efforts on that formal learning time. We don't focus much of our effort on the non-formal learning time. And also we know that not all workplace learning is the same. And again, this comes from some data that comes out of Maastricht University. And the researchers here studied the way in which, to the extent by which learning occurs by job task. So what extent of learning opportunities are there, for example, in daily routine activities and meetings? And the answer they came to, the result they came to was, yes, there are some opportunities for learning, but the real biggest opportunities for learning come from new activities, from challenging activities, from working with more experienced and less experienced colleagues, reading documents, and so on. So there's a difference in terms of the opportunities for learning in that. And actually, when we go back to what the best learning occurring in the workplace comes to, and I often talk about this bit of research by these two gentlemen, Thorndike and Woodworth. They were two very eminent American psychologists. In fact, Thorndike became the president of the American Psychological Association. He was an extremely unpleasant man. He was a racist. He was everything he could not hope to be. But they did some very interesting research. And Thorndike and Woodworth published a paper in 1901, so 121 years ago. And in it they published their theory of identical elements, which theory said that the more elements in the environment where you're going to apply learning is to where you actually learn something. The closer those environments are together, the more effective the learning is. So in other words, if you want to learn to do something, if you want to learn to be a great first-level manager, the best learning environment is when you're being a first-level manager. If you want to learn something practical, if you want to learn how to do something in a spreadsheet, the best place to learn it is when you have the challenge to do it in that environment. So these identical elements. So we've known this for years. We've known this for longer than any of us have been alive. But we still tend to think that it's the learning that happens is the learning that occurs in the formal learning place. And also, as I mentioned in the other research, not all learning is equal. And I showed you this a second ago. But I want to ask you a question about this. So I'm going to ask you another question in Mentimeter. So if you go into your phone, again, if you still have Menti up, can I ask you this question? Looking back over your own career, and I realize that some of you are just starting your careers maybe, but to what extent have these events had a lasting impact on your own development and influence the way you work, and maybe, if you're a leader, the way you lead? Now, can I just say, this research was designed, and I collaborated with a man called Joachim Nisgaard, who was the group head and senior director of talent and management at he's now at Dansk Supermarket. But when we did this work, he was at a company called Ørsted. Ørsted's a Danish company. It's the largest wind farm, offshore wind farm company in the world. But Joachim was very interested in the 70-20-10 approach and the original research, which was done back in the 1980s. So as part of a master's degree he was doing, and I supported him in doing this, he carried out some research in his own team. And one of the questions that were asked was, what are the main barriers to learning in your organization? Now, some of you may not be able to answer this because maybe you're not working in an organization, maybe you're a student. But if you think about what the main barriers to learning are they lack of time, lack of support from an immediate manager, lack of development opportunities, limited technology to actually support learning, learning isn't seen as being critical for the organization, the business, difficulty in managing your own learning, or lack of support from HR and learning and development professionals, or some sort of other reason. So if you can just use the sliders to move those along, and then when you've got them where you want them, just press the thank you, get the response. So
maybe it could be useful to ask my students.
Yeah, it's the same question, absolutely. Yeah.
But they would say lack of time.
Yeah, sure, yeah. I think in that case, maybe with your students, that may be a genuine reason, the lack of time, because they're just overloaded. But I think that the point about this for people who are working in organizations, the lack of time is often because we're thinking about learning as being structured learning. I don't have time to learn because I don't have time to go off and do this course or to do this e-learning module or whatever. And actually, I think that's a false reason, because, as I mentioned, Rafa Nadal, the greatest tennis player in the world, if any of you have watched him, most of you have seen Rafa Nadal play tennis even on television, yeah? Do you notice any particular characteristics of what he does? Anyone like to tell me? He has particular characteristics, except from pulling his trousers out of the back of his trousers all the time. Yeah, well, what do you notice? Oh yeah, all this sort of stuff. Yeah. It's almost like a OCD, like a sort of a psychological problem. Yeah, actually, it's not. He also sits down when he sits down, and he always arranges everything perfectly and spends all this time. What Nadal is doing, and the other thing Nadal does, is he spends more time bouncing the ball before he serves than any other professional. In fact, he's lost points for time wasting more than any other professional tennis player. And often now, I noticed when he was playing in Paris last week, they were commentating on how close to the 0 second he spent before he served. Now, Nadal, that's not just Nadal, that's a learned behavior. Nadal's uncle, when he first started training him, working with him when he was a 16-year-old, Nadal goes through a reflective process every time he plays, before and after, every time he plays a shot. He asks the question, what happened last time? What can I do to correct it? And those are the questions he's asking himself. So he's giving himself time. What Nadal is doing is giving himself just 3 or 4 seconds, 5 or 6 seconds to think, what happened last time? Why did it happen? What can I do? What can I do to correct it? And actually, the academics that have studied Nadal's tennis and Alvarez Dumont and his team at the ASA Business School have looked at tens of thousands of hours of Nadal playing tennis. And Nadal doesn't make the same mistakes again and again. So even people like Federer and Djokovic and other top players get into sort of patterns where they're maybe overhitting a serve or whatever. Nadal doesn't do that. He corrects immediately. So Nadal, that's learned behavior. Now, I often say when I talk to groups of leaders in organizations, don't tell me you don't have time to learn. Because if here's a man working in a really, really challenging environment, he uses 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds to learn. So we can do it that way. So I can see the results here. Lack of time is a major one. And as I say, if you're working in an organization, rethink that. Think, well, actually, how do we create an opportunity, or how do we help people think differently just to be able to take the time back? And I was talking again last night. I have a little card I give to people, to organizations that have 3 questions on it. They say, the first question is, what's been happening? What challenges, what successes have I had? I actually developed it as a tool for managers to be able to have, when they have their one-to-one meetings with their employees, just to turn operational meetings into development meetings. And the first question is, tell me what's been happening since we last met. What challenges have you got? What successes have you had? Let's talk about that. The second question is, well, if you could have that time over again, what would you do differently? So that's the reflective question. That's the question to say, okay, if I did that last time, it worked, I'll do it next time. Or if I did this last time, it didn't work, I'll do something next time. Let's talk about what we could do. And the third question is, what learning has come out of this? And that question's aimed to help people change their mindset to think about learning as being coming out of work, learning from working rather than anything else. So that's good. So looking at these here, lack of time, lack of support from immediate, I mean, all of these are sort of quite balanced, I guess, and all of these often come up as responses to questions. This question. The result that Joachim Nisgaard found was this. Found that increases in job scope, new initiatives, and role models were the development experiences with the lasting impact. They were the key ones. And the ones with the red stars, asterisks on them, job scopes, role models, and coaching and feedback, they were found when he looked at data, or we looked at data identifying high performers in the organization. They were the ones that correlated with high performance. So if we as HR professionals can focus on helping people and helping managers and leaders increase and challenge, increase the job scope of their teams, if we can help them identify role models, exemplary performers, top performers, and learn from top performers. And also if we can provide coaching and feedback as part of, not in terms of necessarily a formal structure, but as part of everyday work, those things are going to really have the impact in terms of top performers. And the third principle, how are we going for time? Okay, just about. Okay, the third principle is actually working with managers and leaders to integrate learning and working. And we know that the relationship between an individual and a manager is the most important indicator of success or failure on the job. And that's not just all of us nodding our heads and saying, yes, it is. There's good research that shows this. So I was involved in some research when I was the Chief Learning Officer at Reuters, Thomson Reuters. And 16 global companies gathered data around managers who were seen as being focused and effective at developing their people, and managers who were seen as being not very focused and not very effective at managing their people. It was interesting gathering the data. We had anonymous 360 feedbacks, we looked at performance outcomes, and we identified these into two different groups. So effective managers who were just, the difference was being just that they were focused and effective at developing their people, and those they weren't. Then the researchers at the Corporate Executive Board, now Gartner Group, they analysed the data that showed that simply having managers who focused and were effective at developing their people in the workplace, those people outperformed others by about 25, 27%. And I often present it by going to groups of senior managers and saying, how would you like it if everyone in your organisation did an extra day's work a week? No cost to anyone, no effort, we don't work Sundays. And the answer is we have managers who do this. And so the research showed that productivity went up by 27%. Retention went up by nearly 40%. So, we all know we join an organisation, we leave a manager. I mean, that's an old saying that's been around for many, many years. Satisfaction, it goes up, employee satisfaction, we have a good manager. All of us have had great managers, I'm sure, and some of us may have had terrible managers. My worst manager is still a good friend of mine. It was the global HR director for a global company. Great man, terrible manager. He knew it, but this happens. And also, this last bit of data here, what the researchers called adaptability. In other words, the ability of people to continue to be productive in times of change. And bearing in mind, I thought for many years about this in times of when the global financial crisis was on. Simply by having a manager who encourages you to continue to work and develop as part of your job will mean that you can continue to be productive, actually significantly more productive. So I'm not going to talk too much about moving beyond learning to work, but it's best to think about learning, how we can support learning, not just by adding learning into work, but by embedding learning in work and actually extracting learning from work. What I mean by that is making sure we reflect on what's gone well. When we have successes, let's talk about it and share it. When we have failures, let's talk about it and share it. So learning from working are all really critical. We talked a lot about that in the book we wrote. And so the 4 takeaways I'd like to give you finally is just to think about if you're going to drive high performance and create a culture of continuous improvement and learning, are people being encouraged to think and learn from their day-to-day experience? And how are you doing that? Secondly, are your managers rewarded or recognized for developing their people? Again, I know of no organizations that don't have a leadership competency framework which has developing others as one of the key competencies. And often I say, how are your managers when they're reviewed? Does that come into it? And the answer is not very often. So we need to make sure that we recognize and reward leaders and managers for developing their people. Also, it's around giving people access to tools and resources in the workplace which help them. So moving from, in fact, I did a big project with Citibank, which has 180,000 employees, moving from courses to resources, courses to campaigns. So thinking about what they could do other than courses that would really help build capability, and very successful. and I could share a paper all around that as well. And lastly, is coaching and mentoring actually an important part of your work culture? Because not just the formal coaching and mentoring, but the informal coaching and mentoring, because those are really, really critical. Thank you very much.